Many thanks for visiting me at my website, and many thanks for taking the time to find out a little bit more about me. I guess you're here because you're interested in property investing and making money from property. But before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. In this day and age, when anybody can post absolutely anything on the internet, it's wise to know a little bit about who you're listening to. So who am I? Well, I guess this is really the story of how I went from being broke to living on my passive income from property and how I did it. But let's start at the beginning. I come from an unremarkable background. My parents weren't rich, but they were comfortable, although I'm sure that they had their own struggles along the way to get to that point. And I had a good education, and you could say that I've been in property all of my working life, because I went to university to study property, and then a few years later I qualified as a chartered surveyor. By the way, that was a really mixed blessing and not as helpful as you might first think. I'll explain why a little later. During my 20s and 30s I went through a number of jobs, both in the private sector and the public sector, until in 1995 I reached the pinnacle of my career. I was a salaried partner in a well-known and respected firm of chartered surveyors in London, dealing with large corporate and multinational clients, mainly advising them about their commercial property investments. I was on a good salary, in a pension scheme, and had a reasonably generous car allowance. But there was a problem. In fact, two major problems. Firstly, I was bored. I was actually surprisingly good at my job, but I didn't like it. I didn't like what I did, and I didn't like the culture within which I did it. I felt like I was being suffocated. Despite having the label partner, I was really just a glorified employee and was overworked and felt underappreciated. Despite that, because I was, and still am, married with 3 children, I felt that I couldn't chuck it all in and leave. That would be irresponsible. But here's where the second major problem kicked in. Because of the recession of the early 1990s, commercial property took a hammering, and my specialisation was no longer required. That meant that I also was no longer required. So I was made redundant a month before Christmas, and with just enough redundancy money to keep us afloat for around 6 months, and only then if we were careful and cut costs to the bone. I needed to do something, and to do it fast. Fast forward to today, and I've been self-employed ever since. I now own a substantial portfolio of residential property investments and can live entirely on the passive income it generates. I realise that I'm living the dream many other people aspire to, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm not saying that to boast, but to give you encouragement that if I can do it, the chances are that you can do it too. When I was made redundant, I had nothing in the way of savings and no regular income, just the redundancy package, but that was set aside and earmarked for living expenses so that my young family would be okay. So I really started with nothing except with the need to make something happen. Okay, you might be thinking, what about your training and years of experience as a chartered surveyor? That must have given you a clear advantage. Well, actually, I'd argue that it didn't. You see, at that point, I was dealing with commercial property, and my knowledge and expertise was totally irrelevant for what I ended up doing, putting together a portfolio of residential investment properties to rent out, what we'd now call buy-to-lets. My experience and knowledge of residential property investing was severely limited, and purely academic, as I had no practical hands-on experience. In fact, I'd say my training as a chartered surveyor had actually encouraged me to be overly cautious, and that was definitely a hindrance I had to overcome before I could take any meaningful action. So what happened between then and now? How did I manage to go from being almost broke and living off the last few pounds of my redundancy package to now living off the almost passive income from a substantial residential property portfolio? Well, I'll be honest, there was a lot of hard work and some, if not many, sleepless nights. But the hard work was focused into what became my system, and that gave me the results I wanted. I didn't have this system when I started. Back then, property information we take for granted today, like how to do property books and courses, just didn't exist. In fact, that's one of the reasons I started writing. And as far as I know, I wrote the first book for ordinary investors like us back in year 2000. The system evolved over time, by trial and error, with me making a lot of mistakes on the way, and at times losing money, until it finally all fell into place and allowed me to scale up to where I am today. Looking back, I can see that the 3 crucial ingredients of my success were need, belief, and the system. I really needed to make something happen. Failure wasn't an option. The belief wavered from time to time, and there were times when I wondered if I should pack it all in, but I didn't. And the system is a system which I refined and tweaked over time until it worked. Now, this wasn't an overnight process. I wasn't an overnight success, not by any means. To get where I am now took several years, with lots of ups and downs along the way. The good news is, because I've already done it, you can learn from what I did, both right and wrong, and hopefully get even better results more quickly. Certainly if I were to start again now, knowing what I now know, I think I'd be able to get to living the dream far more quickly. This is the kind of thing I had to deal with. My first proper rental property was a nightmare. For reasons I won't go into now, because I've covered it in some of my other material, I lost a lot of time pursuing a property deal which didn't happen, so I got frustrated and anxious to get started, and ended up buying a really stupid property. It was a pair of flats in one of the worst parts of town. After I bought it, I found out that the upstairs flat was vacant because the tenant was in prison, and as soon as I completed, the tenant of the ground floor flat did a runner and took the kitchen units with her. I mean, why do people do that? But I dusted myself down, found new and better tenants, and determined to do property investing better from then on. And actually there was a happy ending because I sold the property a couple of years later at a good profit, but that's a story for another time. So, slightly more streetwise and slightly more focused, I started to build my portfolio, this time making sure I didn't make buying decisions based on emotion. That was fine until one day my bank told me they weren't going to lend me any more money for a year. As a new landlord, they wanted to see how I did with the properties I already had before they lent me money to buy more. That stopped me in my tracks just as I'd got some momentum going. The obvious thing was to try different banks, but each time, for different reasons, the answer came back, no, not interested. They just didn't see me or my properties as being worthy of lending. This went on for about 6 months until finally, 3 banks later, I found one who would lend. Not on great terms, but at least I could get some money and move on again. The trouble was that by the time I'd applied to them, and we'd gone through all the formalities and red tape, my year's sabbatical with my main bank was almost over, so in the event I hardly saved any time at all. In fact, that episode cost me a year's worth of progress and taught me a valuable lesson about banks. They really aren't interested in whether you succeed or not, and that might seem obvious now that we're post-credit crunch and have all seen the way they behaved, but at that time I naively thought banks had fairly honourable intentions. So I had to quickly build up momentum again and make up for all that lost time and missed opportunities. I'm glad to say that through practice and fine-tuning, my system was now up and running, and by applying the principles and techniques I'd learned along the way, I was able to put together a substantial property portfolio which now cash flows more than enough to allow me to be financially free. As I mentioned earlier, along the way I started writing about my experiences and helping others take steps towards their property goals as well. This all started by accident, and at first was nothing more than an enjoyable hobby. But as more and more people heard of me and started buying my books and taking action to apply the principles, I had more and more feedback about their success and more requests for help. That led me to write more books, to write for property magazines and blog sites. I contribute regularly to Property Auction News, I've written for Property Investor News, and I'm also a guest blogger for Property Secrets. And I went on to produce one of the UK's most successful home study courses for property investors. By these means I've helped others reach their property goals, and many of them have gone on to put together their own profitable cash-flowing property investment portfolios, and they either are financially free or they're on the way to financial freedom. So my twin goals now are to continue in property, and I still actively buy and sell, and to continue to help others to achieve their property goals. My aim is to make profitable property investing accessible to everyone. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm sure that if you have the desire, you too can develop positive cash flow and passive income, whilst at the same time the value of your properties increase. Now that you've found my website, I hope we can keep in touch and that I'll be able to help you along your property journey. If you haven't already done so, why not enter your name and email details into the box below and receive my free special report? I promise not to bombard you with spam, but I will keep you updated with good quality property information, advice and offers which will help you. Here's to successful property investing.